Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self.
Happy to welcome Gareth Gore. He's the author of the book Opus, The Cult of Dark Money, Human Trafficking, and Right-Wing Conspiracy Within the Catholic Church. So welcome, Gareth, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Clint, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad that we finally met because we tried to do this months ago and we couldn't get the scheduling together, and then I had this retinal surgery. Now we finally made this happen. I'm so excited because I've done loads of episodes on Dominion theology, Christian nationalism. I've never done one on Opus Dei. So I'm really excited to kind of plumb the depths of your knowledge on this subject.
Wow. Well, we can go quite deep. It's quite a rabbit hole that I fell into. So yes.
It is a rabbit hole, and that's the thing. So I read your book because, as we were saying before we hit record, we have a mutual friend in Catherine Stewart. You've met with her a couple times. I've had her on the show loads of times. I've never met her in person, but she's really a good person to come to when you're talking about the Christian right, what's going on, certainly in America and then other parts of the world. But then suddenly you get into Opus Dei, which is kind of a whole adjacent thing. It's a Catholic movement. Now, what led you into this? Because when I read your book, what was fascinating about it is you start out with this investigation of Banco Popular, which was a Spanish bank. It collapsed, I think it was in 2017. Isn't that right? You're like an investigative journalist. You would never have investigated a religious topic. Is that right?
No, not at all. I mean, so I fell into this story completely by accident. I'm kind of an investigative reporter. I specialize in kind of financial stuff. And yes, I was basically asked to report on the collapse of a Spanish bank in 2017. And kind of initially, I wrote the same story as everyone else. They'd taken too many risks. They'd made all of these real estate bets and lent all of this money to all of these developers that had kind of collapsed. So I wrote that story, as did everyone else. But there was something about it that just didn't smell right. There were, certain pieces that didn't quite fit together. And so it became a bit of an obsession. It literally became a hobby. So in my free time, in my evenings, my weekends, I started to delve into the history of Banco Popular, and just kind of got drawn in to this. I fell down the rabbit hole.
You went down the rabbit hole.
Quite literally. And I mean, it was a lot of hard work. I did a lot of good, solid investigative work. But also there's a certain amount of serendipity here. This is the kind of story that every journalist dreams of. Where everything you kind of investigate just opens this door to an even more kind of crazy world, and there's even more to investigate. And every rock you pick up underneath, there's this kind of crazy ecosystem of characters and fraud and all kinds. So it was I count myself very lucky in that I fell into this. But yes, that was the start of what became quite a long journey.
And you had no idea that it was essentially Opus Dei's bank. I mean, that's an overstatement, obviously, but it sounds like you said, I think at some point in the book, it was like Russian dolls. The more layers you peeled away with Banco Popular, the more you begin to find out. What was this kind of Russian doll experience like? Because I remember you said in the book you were talking, I think it was a couple of brothers. They were brothers. One of them, I think, had passed away by the time you got to investigate the story. And that kind is what led you into the first kind of Russian doll, thing. And it was just, kind of went from there, didn't it?
Yeah. So I kind of discovered that the main shareholder of this bank was made up of all of this kind of, they called themselves the syndicate. And it was basically a group of what was supposed to be independent companies. And they all had kind of really weird names. Like one was called the Union for European Investments, and another one was called the Institute for Education and Research. And you're like, these kind of sound a bit odd, and so I basically started to kind of delve into what they were, and I found a number of red flags. like, things like the fact that many of these companies were registered at the very same address. A lot of the directors seem to like shift from one company to the next, and other things like they were making loans to each other, and they were just part of this kind of very suspicious kind of financial. And then I began to make even more connections and found that many of them were sending money to Opus Dei projects around the world. And so that's kind of, when you start finding stuff like that, you're like, this is interesting.
There's something
and
here.
At the same time, you mentioned the two brothers. There was the older brother was called Luis Valls Taberner, and the younger brother called Javier. The older brother, Luis, had died many years earlier, but he basically run the bank for about 50 years. And I found out that he was a member of Opus Dei, and not just any member. He was one of these, what they call numeri members. So these are people who, they're not quite vows, but they basically pledged themselves to Opus Dei. They pledged to lead a life of celibacy, poverty, and obedience to the organization. So he'd run the bank alongside his brother, and his brother was very different. His brother was still alive, and he kind of became the key to unlocking this mystery. Again, I was very lucky in that when I approached him, I think he'd got to a moment in his life where he wanted to unburden himself of things. He was approaching 90. He'd just been given some bad medical news that he knew he didn't really have much longer in this world. And I think, I kind of knocked on his door a few days after he'd received this news. And I think, he just kind of told me the truth. He told me about all of these connections between the bank and Opus Dei.
And you have to wonder, it's like shell corporations in a sense, isn't it? Like Russian doll inside of another Russian doll inside of another one, and yet somehow there are these commonalities. Money is flowing into Opus Dei from a bank, and you're thinking, why? I've never heard of a bank funding a religion we're talking millions and probably billions, would you say, of euros, dollars over the decades flowed from Banco Popular into Opus Dei.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're talking billions. I mean, for sure, it's in the high hundreds of millions. I think probably much, much higher. I think, yes. I mean, it'd be kind of almost impossible to put a number on it. But, I like to think of the bank as basically the cash machine for Opus Dei for like the past 50, 60 years. And, Opus Dei wouldn't be what it is today without the bank, I'm pretty sure.
Exactly. And so what we want to find out is, what were they funding? Now, the question is, though, what's the history of Opus Dei? Because I came across them, I think you mentioned this in the book, a lot of people, if they've heard of Opus Dei at all, it was probably from the Da Vinci Code. And there was kind of this conspiracy theory, the albino monk, who was a part of Opus Dei, and he was an assassin and all this. And it was a shadowy organization. And typical with Dan Brown, I kind of dismissed it. I thought, he kind of makes up some things. It's hard to know if he's really telling the truth. And I since found out that the Opus Dei was a real thing, because then I came across William Barr, who was Trump's attorney general right toward the end of his first term. And he has association with Opus Dei. So it's like, okay, it is a real organization. Where did it start? That's the question. Who started it, and what was the sort of context out of which it came in Spain?
Yeah, I mean, so I a bit like you, I didn't know anything about Opus Dei. And in fact, even the Da Vinci Code kind of semi-passed me by. I was a little bit snooty about the novel, and I was like, I'm not going to read that trash. I ended up having to read it as part of my research for the book, because there's a bit in the book where I talk about how Opus Dei reacted to the book. But yeah, I mean, it's funny you say that as well, because and the other kind of thing I get quite often is that people are quite surprised that this is a relatively new organization. I think people hear the words Opus Dei, which is Latin for work of God, and they think, oh, well, this must be kind of something that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. Well, no, it was actually founded in 1928 by a Spanish priest by the name of Josemaría Escrivá. And basically this guy went on retreat in October 1928, and he had this vision. I mean, he later told his followers that God spoke to him, God revealed this vision for what Opus Dei was going to be. And I think the initial idea was that this would be a a new kind of organization for lay Catholics to help them to go deeper into their faith. Because until that point, if you were a really devout Catholic, if you wanted to kind of be really very serious about your faith, the only real option was to either become a priest or a nun. And so, Escrivá, people could remain in their everyday jobs, and they could still aspire to holiness by striving for perfection in whatever they did and serving God in their daily lives, whether they were a doctor or a teacher, a journalist, a podcaster, whatever you are, you can still aspire to holiness without having to kind of become a priest or a nun. So that's kind of how it started. But what's important to this story of Opus Dei is the backdrop in which Opus Dei was, against which Opus Dei was born. So this is Spain, late 1920s, early 1930s, a country quite literally on the brink of civil war. The workers had risen up, overthrown the monarchy, and they were demanding new rights for themselves. And critically for the story of Opus Dei and for Escrivá, they were turning their backs on the church. So people were beginning to ask questions about the influence that the church had in realms like education and just in wider society. And they were starting to say, well, just a minute, is this what we want? The society was starting to become more secularized, and the socialist government was kind of leading that charge. So Escrivá saw what was happening around him. And to be fair, the priests were being attacked in the streets. You had churches being burned down. It was a time of, real intense violence and tumult. He saw what was happening around him, and this idea for Opus Dei, this thing that had been a very benign idea of just helping people to be better Catholics, started to take on a much more kind of political hue. So his writings kind of really started to shift quite dramatically, and he started to talk about how his followers were part of this hidden army who would basically insert themselves into positions of influence in society and use their positions there to kind of, they would be the kind of reactionary vanguard. They would be pushing back on this kind of progressive agenda. There's a lot of similarities to what's happening today, especially with the Christian nationalists in the West, in the US and other places too. But so I think what started out as quite a benign, benevolent idea, because of the political backdrop, they almost became this kind of hidden militia, this hidden Catholic militia. And then very quickly after the Civil War, once Franco, he won the Civil War, he assumed power, and from that point on, Opus Dei and Franco were kind of almost entered into this alliance. So the Franco regime would give Opus Dei money, and they would give them kind of operational help, set them up in different places, and in return, Opus Dei would help to kind of support the regime. So that's kind of how it started.
Yeah, they would help prop up Franco's regime. Well, as I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the years before the Spanish Civil War, isn't it right that Opus Dei really wasn't catching on very much? It wasn't really a thing. I mean, he was trying, I think, and I remember this if I'm right, wasn't he a law student as well? Or he had at one point, Escrivá had studied law, and he was looking at, okay, I'm going to open these centers up and recruit these law students, the best and the brightest of these students and these learners. And this is kind of the target audience, like you say. He's going to recruit these very, intelligent, mostly men. Young at the time, it was young men, wasn't it? To then place them in positions of influence and power within, at first maybe Spanish society, but then it became a worldwide vision. But if it wasn't for Franco, surely Opus Dei would not be where it is today, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. What you said there is totally accurate. I mean, I think so. In the years before the Civil War, so Escrivá set up these academies where they were basically kind of like cram schools for law students and for architecture students, and as with many things in Opus Dei, it was a front basically. So they advertised themselves as places where law students and architecture students could go and get extra tuition and to help boost their grades or whatever. But what was happening kind of behind the scenes was that, Escrivá and his and the people around him were trying to spot the students who had real potential, and they would kind of keep records about them and make notes about certain things they were interested in. It was the beginning of a kind of a grooming operation, and this is still the way that things work today. So it was a way of collecting information about the students and then using that information to get closer to them and to kind of gently kind of pull them into Opus Dei. But you know what? I mean, in the first few years at least, his recruitment techniques he was a complete failure. Like, I think for the first 3-4 years of Opus Dei, he failed to recruit a single member. And in the years just before the Civil War, things started to pick up. But when war broke out, he literally had about 20 members, and they were all kind of living under one roof. So it was a very small thing. But yeah, things were really transformed after the war, because Franco basically put Opus Dei in charge of a number of dozens of student residences across Spain. So this kind of, I guess, this system that he developed for a seemingly educational institution, which was kind of basically kind of trying to spot potential recruits to bring into this what was rapidly becoming a cult. What the Franco regime did was almost give them financing and the ability to kind of multiply that by dozens of times. So he was doing this all across Spain, and thanks to that support, they recruitment numbers really took off in the 1940s. Mm-hmm. But he was very specifically recruiting people who were either already in positions of power or the next generation of the elite. So he was looking for the top students, because he knew that he used to say this thing to his followers that, basically from the snow-capped mountains, once the snow melts, it trickles down the mountain into streams and rivers, and that's how you kind of you create conditions for things to grow down in the valleys. So this idea that by targeting the elites, by targeting the top students, that was how they would influence society. And so Opus Dei has always been an elitist organization, which is kind of ironic given that they're part of the Catholic Church, and the whole word Catholic derives from ancient Greece for universal, i.e. this is the church that's open to everybody and anyone that wants to join. Opus Dei, by contrast, is by invitation only. It's very much for the elite, and nobody else.
And these are the numeraries. 'Cause I think you mentioned that word before. You talked about the brothers that ran Banco Popular for decades. They were they both numeraries? So they were recruited essentially in, or was it just the one brother? And he was kind of groomed, and then when he takes over Banco Popular, it's like, well, we've got a man on the inside, literally, quite literally, running one of Spain's biggest banks. Here's our route to gaining, money and influence and everything else. Is that the role of a numerary?
It was even worse than that, because actually, so only one of the brothers was a numerary. The other one wasn't a member of Opus Dei at all. In fact, there was a bit of a joke inside the bank. They used to call the two brothers Opus Dei and Opus Night, and they were actually very different characters. The older brother was very serious, very religious, obviously, and the younger brother was a bit of a party animal. He'd be the one that would be sent to kind of schmooze with the clients on the golf course and take them for nice dinners in Madrid and go to various bars or whatever. But actually, with the older brother, they recruited him when he was a teenager, and he didn't just find himself working in the bank, and Opus Dei then used his position there to benefit themselves. He was basically tasked by Opus Dei with hijacking this bank. So they basically found a way. They discovered some compromising information about the former chairman of the bank, and they used that to basically blackmail this guy and force him out. And Opus Dei took control of the bank in the early 1950s. And this guy, Luis Valls Taberner, was basically put in charge of overseeing the bank on Opus Dei's behalf.
And yet, wasn't he? I mean, he was as a numerary living in one of these Opus Dei centers. I mean, it's very strange. The guy is a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar bank, essentially Euro bank, and he's living in kind of this center. And almost a monastic sort of order, wasn't it? Like you got to get up and pray at certain times, and everything's regulated. So you think, what in the world? This is such a juxtaposition of this is not what a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar bank would be, how he would be living, but he's living in this Opus Dei center somewhere in Spain.
No, absolutely. I mean, he kind of led a double life. So yeah, by day he was this bank executive, meeting with big clients, politicians, other people inside the bank, and then every evening he went home to this Numeri residence where he lived with like 12 other men, and I mean, they basically, once they were home, every minute of their existence is kind of dictated. So these guys, they wake at 6 a.m. on the dot every day. They jump out of bed, they kiss the floor and say, Serviam, which is basically, I serve you, Lord. And then, they follow this very strict routine of, they do mass like a couple of times a day. They've got to pray certain prayers at certain times. They've obviously got to confess and do various kind of Bible readings. And this is on top of the day job. And this guy, being the CEO of a bank, he's probably working like 12-hour days or whatever, but still having to fit in all of these other religious obligations kind of on the side. Because, inside the center, there's very much this culture, they call it fraternal correction, which is that, if anyone sees you not complying with what's expected of you, then you kind of get reported on. There's this kind of, and it's part, these houses are, there's so much kind of control and manipulation going on inside. Like every thing you do, even the letters you write, phone calls, you're being watched constantly, and your so-called brothers are informing on you. You're going to confess to a priest and you think that in the seal of the confessional will keep anything secret, but no, the priest is actually kind of reporting what you've said up to the kind of director of the house.
Pass it up the chain. Well, and there's
it's a kind of really quite horrible
very controlling. Certain materials,
exactly.
Reading materials are banned and books are banned and things like that as well. So that was what struck me right away. It sounded like all the hallmarks of a classic cult, like you say, grooming people, bringing them in, then instituting very strict controls over their lives. So at the same time, here's Escrivá. He's building this organization in Spain. He's building legitimacy in Spain, but then there's a connection now with the wider Catholic Church. How does that work? Because take us through that. There was a whole battle. What struck me was that with each successive pope that came along, some were more receptive to Opus Dei, some weren't. And he's trying to then get legitimacy within the Catholic Church worldwide. How did that exactly work? Because, he got some extraordinary benefits and blessings from certain popes along the way, didn't he?
Yeah, Opus Dei has had, and this is still very much true today, a kind of up and down relationship with the Vatican. So to begin with, Opus Dei kind of, whenever it's set up in a new diocese, it kind of had to go to the local bishop and ask permission to operate there, which is kind of not only quite time consuming, but also makes you quite vulnerable, because if the bishop decides that they don't want you there anymore, they can just kick you out. So Escrivá very early, in the mid 1940s, had a real kind of concerted effort to get kind of global authorization from the Vatican, and he managed to get that. And so, from the late 1940s, Opus Dei was basically free to operate wherever it wanted to in the world. But again, there was this kind of, it wasn't quite clear what they were, and local archbishops and bishops would sometimes kind of make life difficult for them or whatever. And also as Opus Dei expanded and as the group became more powerful, the founder, who had all of these kind of delusions of grandeur, and he was telling his followers to collect relics, as through his life, because they would be required afterwards, and told them to. He was a kind of a very kind of strange individual, but he he kind of, I think, at one stage, so they had this particular kind of status within the church. They were called a pious union, but there were many pious unions out there. And I think at one stage, he was almost kind of offended. He thought, Opus Dei has got to such a level now that we shouldn't be classified at the same level as all of these kind of little groups. And so there was a big lobbying effort to get the Vatican to grant it a special status. And there was quite a bit of resistance, especially from Pope Paul VI. He was extremely suspicious about Opus Dei, the way it operated, its kind of cult-like practices. There were all of these rumors as well that Opus Dei had infiltrated many of the corridors of power at the Vatican. This is in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and that it was kind of basically spying on the church itself. And so he didn't want to give them this special status. But then when Pope John Paul II came in the late 70s, he had been very close to Opus Dei whilst he was the Archbishop of Krakow. And Opus Dei had kind of sponsored John Paul II and published many of his speeches, printed books, and kind of disseminated them around. They basically promoted him, and I guess when he became Pope, he felt that he kind of owed them one, but also he saw them as a group of fellow conservatives that he could trust. And I think it's important to remember that back then in the early 1980s, the church was as divided as it is today. The Catholic Church was as divided as it is today. There were a lot of outspoken left-leaning archbishops around the world who were kind of at odds with some of the policies that John Paul II had. And he kind of wanted to assert his authority. And I think he saw Opus Dei as almost like his Green Berets. He saw them as this elite force that he could dispatch to anywhere in the world, and kind of, if somebody was causing trouble, he could send them there and either to kind of report back or to, I guess, take over the Catholic world and culture in that particular area. And so he gave them a special status. He made them this thing called a personal prelature, which has never been granted to any other Catholic organization before or since. And which basically allowed Opus Dei to operate outside of the normal hierarchy of the church. So they were answerable since the early 1980s. Opus Dei has been answerable only to the Pope. Whenever there's any trouble at local level, the local archbishop has absolutely no jurisdiction over this group. And so what that's done is, in addition to giving them this enormous power to operate wherever they want and do whatever they want, it's also kind of allowed a lot of these cult-like abuses to kind of fester, because at least locally, when things are reported locally, the local authorities can do nothing at all they have no jurisdiction. And so it's empowered Opus Dei, but it's also allowed a lot of these abuses to really fester and go unchallenged.
And I definitely want to come back to that, because there was a case in Argentina, wasn't there, of a woman who tried for years to come forward and no one would listen to her, and that's kind of a breaking story now. But going back to this, so I'm trying to put a picture together. So they've got money flowing in from Banco Popular, and then they're expanding. Once they get the green light from the Catholic Church, they're not just in America, they're worldwide, aren't they? They've got centers near universities, colleges. They've got schools, like grade schools, elementary schools, primary schools that are specifically Opus Dei schools for children. What else have they got? Because their reach is global now. They've got centers literally in every country, on every continent of the world. Isn't that right? And they've got money flowing in from very wealthy benefactors. They don't have to rely on Banco Popular anymore. I mean, that's gone now. But they've still got money flowing in from very deep pockets of Catholic donors worldwide.
Yeah, so just to put some numbers on it, I mean, Opus Dei currently has almost 100,000 members around the world. It operates in about 70 different countries: the United States, the United Kingdom, all across Latin America, Asia, Africa too. It operates about 300 schools around the world. It has, I think, 19 or 20 universities of its own. It operates a business school in one of the best business schools in the world, this place called ESA, SE, is an Opus Dei university. It has, as you just mentioned, and this is especially in the US, a presence on almost every kind of Ivy League campus. In more recent years, and the Financial Times actually did an excellent piece about this mid-May, where they detailed all of these foundations that have been set up by Opus Dei, which, to come back to what we were saying earlier about, there's nothing about these foundations which it's a hint that they're in any way linked to Opus Dei, and it's the way that they present themselves to the students and to the university authorities is that we are basically educational institutions that we want to foster debate and philosophy, literature, culture, this kind of thing. There's no mention of being any way related to Opus Dei. So they have these all around the US, and they have this huge network of interlinked foundations that pass money between each other and which have vast resources. In the US alone, and the US is not a particularly big country in terms of membership for Opus Dei. They only have about 3,000 members in the US compared to maybe like 40,000 members in Spain and tens of thousands of members in places like Italy, Mexico. I managed to link Opus Dei to about 150 different non-profit organizations, and between them they had assets of well over $1 billion. And so if they have that kind of presence and assets in the United States, then we can only imagine what the kind of global wealth and reach of Opus Dei really looks like.
Mm-hmm. Well, how have they expanded into American politics? I mentioned William Barr, and he was another one. He kind of disavowed his affiliation, but there's this organization called the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C., which is, again, very benign. It seems like it's just a bookstore. That's all it is. Find out about Catholicism, go to the CIC, but there's a huge backstory there, because I think Bill Barr was on the board of the CIC. I think he was associated or affiliated with it. He kind of disavowed it, but how have they managed to infiltrate the corridors of power? Because they've had influence in getting some of the latest Supreme Court judges put on the bench who are all Catholics, and overturn Roe versus Wade and everything else. So they're pushing a very conservative political/religious agenda. They've got an agenda for sure, haven't they? Certainly in American politics.
Well, I mean, and it's no accident as well.
Mm-hmm.
The whole kind of modus operandi of Opus Dei is to target the political elite, the judicial elite, the business elite, because they realize that if you have an agenda, if you have a political agenda, then that's how you get that agenda to become a reality. And so for years, they've basically thrown all the resources they can specifically at Washington, D.C. The 3,000 members that Opus Dei has in the United States, about a third of those live in the D.C. area, which kind of tells you all you need to know about how they've targeted recruitment. I mean, as a Catholic organization, you would expect the main memberships to be kind of in places like Boston, Chicago, New York, Miami, because of the big Latin American population. But no, the biggest Opus Dei community in the US lives in the DC area. And yes, there's this bookshop and chapel on K Street, which is kind of lobbying central in the heart of DC.
Yeah, right
they have a blue plaque. Well, yeah, they even have a blue plaque inside where they boast about being the closest tabernacle to the White House, which again tells you all about
all you need
the
to
mentality of these people. On the board of this place, the Opus Dei Center in Central Washington, you've had people like Bill Barr, Leonard Leo, who was is the vice president of the Federalist Society, and the man who's been single-handedly orchestrated the conservative Catholic takeover of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Kind of a kingmaker when it comes to judges, really, isn't it? Just hand a
Absolutely.
list of judges to Donald Trump and say, hey, these are the ones we want to put on the bench, and who cares?
That's quite literally what he did. Absolutely. And you've got other people like Kevin Roberts, who's the president of the Heritage Foundation, the guy behind Project 2025, Mick Mulvaney, Trump's former chief of staff, Pat Cipollone, the former kind of White House chief counsel. The list goes on. I mean, these guys have really very successfully penetrated the Washington, D.C. elite. And I recently learned as well that J.D. Vance now sends his eldest son to the Opus Dei school just outside of Washington, D.C. So they've also managed to kind of coax the vice president of the United States into the network. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a member.
Sinister.
But it's I think a very good way of thinking about Opus Dei as well is as it's a network of influence, and some of the people in that network are full-on members. Some people are what they call cooperators, but sort of not members, but they support Opus Dei financially or otherwise. And some people are just kind of I guess co-conspirators or sympathizers, and I'm guessing that J.D. Vance would kind of fall into that court. But still, it kind of shows you whether he's a member or not, right in the heart of DC.
Absolutely. Well, this is the other thing we mentioned. Okay, the abuses, because you talk about this in the book. There's this specific case in Argentina. So you've got these centers, these Opus Dei centers typically near universities and things like that. They want to recruit these best and brightest students. Okay, we get that's their MO. But then there's these women who are recruited to basically work in these centers, and that's where a lot of the abuse has occurred, as well as there's been kids abused in Opus Dei schools and youth camps and things they've run in the summer by Opus Dei priests. This is a breaking story as well. What can you tell us about some of the abuse cases you've heard of?
So, I mean, abuse happens at almost every level.
Sure.
Even these kind of elite numeraries who are recruited, they are they're targeted and groomed as young kids. Mm-hmm. And they are coerced into joining when they aren't even adults. They might be 14, 15, 16 years old. And they're subject to this whole system of manipulation, control, psychological, spiritual abuse that happens inside. There are many instances of people committing suicide, but also people becoming really acutely mentally ill, and Opus Dei using drugs to cover up the symptoms. So that happens at all levels. But the thing that you're talking about there is as well as recruiting these elite members and having these kind of single sex residences for the numeraries to live in. The founder very early on decided that in order to kind of maintain a certain lifestyle within these residences, and to ensure that the members of the residences, the numeraries, could maximize the amount of time they were at recruiting other people and kind of pushing the Opus Dei agenda, he decided that they needed servants in these residences, and he couldn't just trust anyone to be the servants, because to come in and cook and clean or whatever, they might start asking questions about this kind of really odd lifestyle that these guys are living inside the house, and all the kind of strange practices that are happening. Yeah. And so he realized that actually the servants also need to be kind of full-on members, and so he began to recruit this kind of underclass of members that he called them the kind of assistant numeraries. Mm-hmm. And these are all women. They're often recruited from underprivileged communities.
Very young
recruited
girls.
in places like Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and they're groomed, they're coerced into joining, and then they're trafficked around the world to wherever they're needed. So they're sent to work in a center in Washington DC or in London or in Stockholm, wherever they might be needed by the organization. And this has kind of really hit the headlines because a group of women who used to be members of Opus Dei, who used to be these numerary servants, they have basically filed a complaint. And public prosecutors in Argentina have taken their complaint. They conducted a 2-year investigation and have since filed criminal charges against Opus Dei for enslavement and human trafficking. And I know through my work that what was happening in Argentina wasn't a one-off. What was happening there was happening all over the world. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is potentially the tip of the iceberg. I know for a fact there are many other women that have come forward who've experienced similar abuse, trafficking, enslavement in places like Ireland, Mexico, the Philippines, all over. And so I think this could be the next big scandal to hit the Catholic Church.
So what is your concern about Opus Dei? Because now we've talked about there's abuses, allegations for sure. Would you say it's a cult? What is your main concern about Opus Dei now going forward that you've done all this reporting?
I mean, I choose my words very carefully, but I would say I would absolutely have no hesitation about saying that Opus Dei is an abusive cult and is, I believe that it's an organization that preys on the good faith of individuals, of good Catholics who believe that they are being helped by this organization, and it kind of basically manipulates that goodwill that people place in it. And I think the fact that it's kind of been legitimized by the Vatican, not just with this special status that they have, but with, by the fact that the founder of Opus Dei has been made into a saint by John Paul II. He's now Saint Josemaría. I think this gives the group this kind of added legitimacy, which makes recruitment and grooming easier because they've basically got the stamp of approval from the Vatican. And so I think that I've been calling for the church to do something about the group ever since the book came out. And initially Opus Dei was already going through some kind of reforms. They'd been asked to basically, by Pope Francis, following the case in Argentina, Pope Francis basically ordered the group to rewrite its statutes, and that's kind of been going on for some time. And of course, Pope Leo was elected in May 2025, and initially, kind of, it wasn't quite clear where he stood on the matter and what he was going to do. He invited Opus Dei in to meet him. He kind of he made a number of kind of concessions to conservative Catholic movements, traditional Latin Mass movements, and etc., etc. And so it almost seemed like he wanted to build bridges between left and right. Whereas Francis had, I think, angered a lot on the right. I think Leo initially wanted to be a bridge builder, but actually I was a little bit disappointed for the first few months of Leo's papacy, because it appeared that he was making too many concessions to Opus Dei and wasn't really taking any of these allegations of abuse very seriously at all. And then I got a call a few weeks back when I was on a work trip, and I was told that Pope Leo wanted to meet me, and so we arranged the meeting, and I went to the Vatican and met with Pope Leo in the middle of March. I spent 45 minutes with him, just the two of us in a room, and I didn't really know beforehand what he wanted to talk about. Nobody really told me what the meeting would be about or what he wanted to learn.
Well, you assumed it was something to do with Opus Dei for sure.
Well, yes. I mean,
Why am I here?
I assumed he didn't want to talk about Wigan, the town that I'm from, or what I thought about
something Opus Dei related.
AI or whatever. Yeah. I kind of guessed it would be about Opus Dei, but I didn't quite know whether what to expect. And I went just kind of with this attitude of I need to speak truth to power. I need to tell him this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to really. This is a unique opportunity to tell the Pope, the guy who's in charge of the whole thing, to tell him what's happening in the name of the Catholic Church and what he can do about it. And I was half expecting, so I went in there, was kind of told him what I knew, what I discovered. I was half expecting him to be pressing his buzzer after 5 minutes to have someone come in and kind of take me out or whatever.
Got an urgent meeting
he
right
sat
now.
There.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but he was genuinely very interested in everything I had to say. He asked me some very good questions, very insightful questions. And little did I know, but as we were sat there in the meeting, he had ordered the Vatican kind of press office to publicize the meeting as much as possible. He had people come in, take pictures with us. And, I think he wanted to send a message that he's onto this now, and he's taking these allegations very seriously. And so I'm very hopeful that something will happen. I'm very hopeful that the Catholic Church will take action against Opus Dei. Now, what action it takes
what
is,
does that look like?
Who knows?
They're so big and so powerful now.
They're so big, they're so powerful,
so well
but also
funded.
the Catholic Church has this huge problem as well with the sainthood. I mean, they've made the founder of Opus Dei into a saint, and nobody's ever been made into a saint and then had that sainthood taken away. And so you have the problem of, what do you do about an abusive organization that whose founder is revered as someone who's up in heaven working miracles on people, who's an actual saint. So I think that's going to create a lot of difficulty for them. So yeah, I'm not sure how they're going to really kind of square that circle, but it's not my problem.
It's a tough one.
It's theirs.
Well, what kind of reactions have you gotten to the book? Because I can imagine, let's say, if you're a conservative Catholic, you'd probably be applauding the work of Opus Dei worldwide, because, as you said, it's like a secret army. They're conservative, very conservative, if not almost a fundamentalist kind of a sect of Catholicism. And, they're doing the work of God. Look at the amazing inroads they've made all over the world. They're growing, they're expanding. It's a wonderful thing. But then I noticed there was a response from the Opus Dei organization itself to your book. What can you tell us about that?
I mean, the reaction to the book by Opus Dei, I think, has been quite telling. So before the book actually hit the shops, the first strategy was to basically hit me and my publisher with legal threats. They basically threatened to bankrupt me, bankrupt the publisher. And when that didn't work, and we released the book anyway because we were confident that what it was saying was absolutely accurate.
You've done your research.
Various lawyers had been through the book and examined the evidence, and they were very happy with what we were saying in the book. So when the threats didn't work, they then kind of launched this smear campaign against me and tried to depict me as a liar. They tried to imply that I'd been paid off by some kind of George Soros-like figure who was out to get Opus Dei.
Smear campaign, yeah.
But what they didn't do was engage with any of the facts. And I think that's quite telling. I've been a journalist for more than 20 years. I've seen so many kind of scandals, corruption cases or whatever. And normally when there's a big expose of a company or a person or an organization, the organization normally responds by kind of holding their hands up and saying, we're going to investigate this fully. We're going to get to the bottom of this. If there's been any wrongdoing, we'll hold anyone that's responsible accountable. Opus Dei has done none of that. It has no interest in getting to the bottom of these allegations. All it wants to do is protect itself. And so they wrote this long document where they tried, they basically tried to have the last word on what was what the book was saying. And but yeah, at no stage have they actually pledged to investigate or to eradicate any abusive practices, which I think actually is extremely telling. And I think anyone out there wondering whether this is a good or bad organization only needs to look at the reaction they've had to the book to work out.
They're not saying
what kind of
we want to be
organization they are.
It kind of reminds me of the story. I don't know if you followed the American story. When that article came out in the Atlantic about Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, about him being drunk and disorderly and out of control and abusive and all the rest of it, and he threatened to sue them. And in the end, more people came out and said, actually, there's more stories if you want to hear. So it's kind of backfired. Have you heard any more? Have more victims come forward since you wrote the book?
Absolutely. You know what? Not a week goes by. The book's been out now for more than 18 months. Not a week goes by without someone, either a current member or former member, reaching out to me, thanking me for writing the book, sharing, their stories, their experience, or often horrific experiences inside of Opus Dei. I've even had current priests from within Opus Dei reach out to me to thank me for the book, which tells you also something, it's a very interesting insight into the organization at present, because I think, from the communication with this one particular guy, it was quite apparent that even inside the organization, people are aware that something is wrong, something is rotten. But many people feel trapped. What Opus Dei does, especially with the Numeri members and the Numeri assistants, is that they suck you in, they cut you off from your family networks, your professional networks. They basically want to take control of your life. They want to make you completely dependent on the organization.
Classic
they
cult psychology.
Control your finances. And so, many people, even wanting to leave, even being uncomfortable with the life they're leading inside of this abusive cult, they're unable to because they lack the independence, they lack the means to basically cut themselves off and move on. And so, yeah, I mean, it's even inside the organization, there are people desperate for the church to actually do something so that they can move on with their lives.
Mm-hmm. I would say it just sounds like classic cult tactics and psychology, as you mentioned. Well, your book is called Opus, The Cult of Dark Money, Human Trafficking, and Right-Wing Conspiracy Within the Catholic Church. Thank you so much, Gareth Gore. If you ever come up this way, I know you're from Wigan, so you're not too far from where I'm at in Lancaster. I would love to sit down with you, buy you a pint, and we can maybe put the world to rights, and we can talk about Christian dominion theology and all sorts of other things, as well as Opus Dei. So thank you so much for talking to me today.
I may well take you up on that offer one day. Thank you, Clint, for having me on there.